From Software has delivered some of the greatest video games of all time, a studio that rightfully gained prominence thanks to its genre-defining Soulsborne titles, from the raw brilliance of Demon's Souls on PlayStation 3 culminating in the recently released Elden Ring, the year's most successful game. However, controversy has surrounded performance and technology, and today I'm going to be tackling a key issue head-on. Why is it that From can't get 30 FPS right? In a world where developers like Guerrilla Games and Playground can present silky smooth 30 FPS presentations, why is it that practically every From Software title stutters like this, even though our performance tools are showing that they do indeed run locked at 30 FPS? Well, let's get this out in the open straight away. Patches are available for hacked PlayStation 4s that address the issue. Bloodborne, Elden Ring, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, all of them have a problematic 30 FPS cap, and based on the evidence I'll share today, perhaps all of them could be fixed with just a simple tweak to a couple of lines of code. Shocking, right? Can't be true, surely. There's got to be some kind of explanation. But well, I've done the legwork here, and on the face of it, the patches, well, I've tested them and they work. So yeah, on the surface, it looks pretty damning to From Software that such a simple tweak can solve the issue, but it turns out that things might be a little bit more complex. But yes, the patches do work in addressing the key issue. From's dodgy 30 FPS is indeed fixed. So let's kick off with a more in-depth look at Bloodborne. So if I slowly pan the camera around here, you'll note some obvious stutter, right? The game looks like it's losing performance with those stutters, but believe it or not, in this instance at least, it is actually running at 30 frames per second locked. Okay, so maybe some of you out there are watching a low-res YouTube encode with a decimated frame rate, and possibly you aren't seeing the full effect of the issue. So let's run that again at half speed. So you should be able to see the problem here. But here's how the patched version looks. So first of all, full speed, panning around the central character here. It's 30 frames per second, yes, so not silky smooth like 60 or 120, but the point is that the update is consistent. Now let's slow it down. Again, 30 FPS has its limits, but you'll note that frames are consistently delivered. No stutters, no perceived drops in performance, 30 FPS as it should be. Again, go back to the standard Bloodborne, lurches and stutters. It's not great. And as I said, it's affected every From title on the vanilla PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, right up to Elden Ring, which has exactly the same issue, despite releasing 7 years after Bloodborne. So, for those of you in the know, you might be wondering why I'm labouring this point, but it's important, right? From Software titles are the embodiment of a classic Digital Foundry nemesis. Yes, inconsistent or bad frame pacing. And here's how we attempt to graph that in our performance metrics. Frame rate on the bottom left there, 30 frames per second, as I said, though you'll note that the line there, it's slightly wobbly. Now, frame rate is calculated from an average of frame times, and there's where you actually see the stutter on the bottom right. This is what inconsistent frame pacing is all about. That line there should be solid, locked to 33 milliseconds. Every time you see a hitch or stutter on screen, you'll note that the frame time reading is either above or below the 33 millisecond point, either 16.7 milliseconds or 50 milliseconds. These frames persist for shorter or longer than the average 33 milliseconds, and that presents to the human eye as stutter. Now let's look at the patched version of the same game. And yes, it's entirely clean. Yes, the frame rate line is still 30 FPS, though this time there isn't any of that slight wobbling effect. And the reason that there is no wobble can be found by looking at the frame time graph. Every frame persists for 33 milliseconds. 33.3 recurring if you're into your decimal points. Entirely consistent, no stutter, the way it should be. Yes, obviously 60 frames per second is a lot better than 30, but if you are going to compromise to 30, the best way forward is to synchronize each new frame with every other refresh of your display, every 33 milliseconds. Yes, it's slower, it's not as smooth, but it's just as consistent, and that's something that From Software has got wrong with every single one of its titles in the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One era. So we've looked at Bloodborne so far, and it's actually shocking how much of an improvement this patch delivers in terms of visual consistency. I've been speaking to the person responsible for the patches, who goes by the hacker alias Illusion, and well, here's how it works. From Software uses its own formula to calculate how to present 30 frames per second, but essentially it's very basic and doesn't seem to understand exactly when to present new images. Illusion's patch deletes the call to From Software's own 30 FPS limiter, and in the case of PlayStation 4 replaces it with this system call, SCE Video Out Flip Rate, which does properly implement consistent frame pacing. Now, why From would want to use their own cap, we can only speculate. Illusion reckons that the same code could be deployed on all formats without relying on individual console SDKs. That might be an explanation, but the point is that Microsoft too has its own library that does the same job in delivering consistent frame pacing. So on the face of it then, if a hacker could implement this fix, why doesn't From Software implement it too? Got some theories on that, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But so far, I've used Bloodborne as the example, but let's move to the next game in the timeline, Dark Souls 3. It's the same story. The vanilla PlayStation 4 runs at a consistent 30 frames per second, 1080p resolution. But you'll see the same hitching and stuttering that we saw earlier in Bloodborne. Now, there's no rhyme or reason to when the stutter may manifest itself, but the point is that once the From Software frame rate cap is removed, replaced with the Sony SCE Video Out Flip Rate call, well, suddenly the presentation is a lot smoother. All stutter gone, a consistent 30 frames per second. Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. Yeah, of course, it's the same thing again. I'm doing a similar test to that used with Bloodborne at the beginning of the video. To best show the problem via this medium, a slow pan around the player character highlights that Sekiro just isn't running correctly at 30 frames per second. And yes, inevitably, once the Sony call is inserted in place of From Software's frame rate cap, the delivery is indeed that consistent 33 milliseconds that we're looking for. All the peaks and troughs on the frame time graph are gone. There's a consistent line there, indicating consistent performance. Elden Ring next, and yes, obviously, having discussed this one relatively recently, you'll obviously know that the same problem is in place here. In this case, I'm having to use the network test version, as the full game requires a firmware not supported by hacked PlayStation 4 consoles. But even so, everything seen here applies to the final game too. Even in GPU-light scenarios, such as the underground training area, the stutter can be very bad. But frame consistency outdoors actually looks a little different, and if we switch to Illusion's patched version, you can see why. While Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro weren't taxing the GPU in my test scenes, Elden Ring is more demanding, so 50 millisecond frame time dips here are actual genuine performance limitations. Even so, with the patch in place, we're still getting a much more consistent experience overall. So, curious about why From would use its own 30 FPS cap, I went back to the PlayStation 3 generation to see what I could discover. Demon's Souls, the OG. Yes, it has the same 30 FPS issue with inconsistent frame delivery. Looking at Dark Souls, I only played this one for a little while, but this looks better. Well, when I say better, performance obviously isn't great, but the 30 FPS cap seems to be properly delivered, unless the game is GPU limited. Once past taxing content, there's a small bout of 16 millisecond frames before we get back to normal, but that normal does seem to be properly consistent, so overall I'd call this progress. Looking at Dark Souls 2, however, performance truly is dreadful right from the off. From's strategy here was pretty straightforward. Unlock frame rate completely and hope for the best. Bloodborne and the entire PlayStation 4 era though. Well, yeah, we're back to that broken 30 FPS implementation. And looking to the new consoles, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series, not to mention PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, well, From actually moved on from a capped 30 FPS in a move that I think is actually not particularly a great idea. Instead, the developer favoured an unlocked frame rate, which in many cases hovers in 30 to 40 frames per second territory. If we take a look at how that looks on the frame time graph, you're still seeing the baseline 33 millisecond frame persistence, but with added spikes to 16 milliseconds. Every one of those spikes becomes an extra bit of stutter in the presentation, as you can see here. Performance mode improves matters in that the baseline shifts to 16.7 milliseconds, but with stuttering to 33.3. So we're still lacking consistency. Ideally, it should be locked to 60 with a locked 16.7 millisecond frame time. It's not the ideal situation on the new machines then, and more to the point, we've actually seen a Souls game on the PS5 that seemingly does everything right. It's just that From Software wasn't really involved with it. I'm referring, of course, to the Demon's Souls remake, courtesy of Bluepoint Games. This one is quite interesting because Bluepoint's MO with its remakes is to run the original engine code alongside its own engine. Just like Elden Ring, quality and performance modes are offered, but unlike Elden Ring, it nails exactly how these modes should present. Performance mode targets 1440p with temporal upscaling to 4K and delivers a wonderfully silky smooth 60 frames per second experience. That consistent 16.7 millisecond frame time graph line is confirmed there. The quality mode, you've guessed it, native 2160p with a consistent 30 FPS and again a straight 33.3 millisecond frame time line. Honestly, this should be the way forward. I want to make one more point about this entire 30 FPS consistent frame pacing issue. I've tried to explain the problem here in relatively simple terms along with clear visual demonstrations of the problem, precisely because some people might be watching this thinking it's a DF nitpick that only those with trained eyes will notice, but that's not the case, and I want to stress that a properly implemented 30 frames per second is nothing new. It really isn't. It's been the standard for so many years. So yeah, take a look at Namco's Ridge Racer, the legendary launch game for the original PlayStation's 1994 debut. The arcade machine ran at 60 frames per second, but the home version was just 30 frames per second. But not just 30 frames per second, 30 frames per second with an even 33 millisecond frame consistency. That consistency actually fooled many at the time into thinking it was an arcade perfect 60 frames per second conversion, but it wasn't. Put simply, 30 FPS may be a compromise, but there's a right way to do it, established over decades. So watching each and every From title play out with this problem, it's a bit of a blow. Maybe with the issue out now in the open, fixes will be forthcoming, but this leads us on to the sting in the tail and possibly the reason why this patch as it exists here was never implemented into the shipping code, and it's all about input lag. Back in the day when the first Destiny launched in beta form, Digital Foundry took Bungie to task on poor frame pacing, which marred the 30 FPS presentation. Now the developer did fix it at the time, citing how the solution needed to retain the game's low input lag. In short, their solution wasn't a 3-line code fix, and yeah, it turns out that latency, the time between controller input and response on screen, increases significantly with these patches. So I'm not going to mention specific latency results because it may well be the case that lag is built into the animation system, as seen most prolifically in Rockstar titles like Red Dead Redemption 2, but like-for-like measurements showing the difference between unpatched and patched code using the exact same animations are absolutely fair game. And to get these results, I used not one, but 2 high-speed cameras because, to put it frankly, I couldn't believe some of the latency results I was getting. Bloodborne first, which shows the biggest difference. Now, remarkably, the delta between the unpatched code and Illusion's patched rendition comes in at a big 78 milliseconds on average, basically an extra 4 to 5 frames of delay from pressing the button to something happening on screen. Elden Ring is a bit better with a 50 millisecond or 3 frame delta, but it's only better because the vanilla code is actually laggier than Bloodborne. Typically, the more complex a renderer, the more lag there is. Getting latency low is not easy. So, did Bluepoint solve the issue with Demon's Souls remake? Well, I don't think they did. My 30 FPS input lag results were very similar to the Bloodborne patch experience, but at 60 frames per second, man, the game is so much better. In my tests, input lag reduced by a colossal 85 milliseconds. So yes, running at 60 really is the way forward. Looks like not even Bluepoint could get a responsive 30 FPS experience with consistent frame delivery, though at least we did get a consistent frame delivery. Right, well, let's wrap all of this up then. I wanted to look into this story because the 30 FPS delivery of all From Software games on the last generation is just really poor, and the developer's solution to unlock frame rate on PS5 and Series X may improve matters, but we're still getting a stuttering experience. When I heard that a tiny code fix could make 30 FPS so much better, that's a pretty compelling story, right? It's something I had to look into. And it would be easy to call for From Software to instigate those fixes and solve the issue. And it could be solved, right? Using the 30 FPS system calls designed by the platform holders would work, I suspect, for both PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. And that's the story I was ready to go with. But then I thought to myself, if the solution is so easy, why hasn't From Software done it? The answer is that input lag rises dramatically, especially impactful on Bloodborne in particular, which showed the biggest delta, but Elden Ring already pretty laggy, and it's just made worse by the patches. So while the graphical issues can be fixed, there's a price to pay, and it's not an ideal one. If you own Demon's Souls Remake on PlayStation 5, give the 30 FPS mode a go. That's what the patched experience would feel like on those older From Software titles without further optimization. But it can be done, right? That optimization can happen. We've seen games with a perfectly fine 30 FPS running with much lower input lag, 100 milliseconds or even lower in the most optimized cases. I'd still cite Demon's Souls as the model going forward for future titles in terms of presentation, but with a view possibly to keeping lag much lower in the 30 FPS mode. One final note. For the record, I don't recommend hacking your PlayStation 4 in the way we have for this video. It opens the door to a range of fascinating technical curiosities, mind you, and Illusion, who did the From Software patches here, has a pretty awesome YouTube channel and blog that has some very interesting testing, but ultimately hacking your console effectively locks you out of the PlayStation Network and indeed any game that requires system software higher than version 9.0, and that includes Elden Ring. So yeah, it's great fun to mess about with if you have a spare unit lying around, but yeah, it's not particularly recommended generally. And that's the end of this video. A long time in the making, this one, so if you want to support this kind of work, please, of course, like, subscribe and share, and ring the notification bell for those notionally instant notifications. If you really like what we do, please consider the DF supporter program. Tons of bonus material, early access, a brilliant community, a revitalized DF retro made possible by backing our team. We're super proud of it, so do get involved. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.